The man you ignore today might be the man who owns the ground beneath your feet tomorrow. I heard those words years ago from my father, but I never understood their meaning until the night my wife looked at my work boots, smiled politely, and acted like she barely knew me. My name is Nathan Carter, and for most people in that room, I was just another small construction company owner trying to fit into a world that was never built for people like me. The ballroom of the Sterling Plaza Hotel was filled with polished shoes, expensive suits, and conversations about million-dollar deals. Crystal glasses reflected the golden lights above, and every person seemed to know exactly where they belonged. I stood near the entrance with my hands in the pockets of my old brown jacket, watching my wife Lauren move through the crowd like she had been born there. She wore a black dress that matched the confidence in her voice, laughing with executives from the company where she worked. To everyone around her, she was Lauren Carter, the successful marketing director who helped shape major campaigns for one of the most respected firms in the city. To me, she was still the woman who once sat beside me in a tiny apartment eating takeout on the floor because we could not afford a dining table. But that version of Lauren felt farther away every year. A few feet away, I heard Ethan Brooks, one of Lauren's co-workers, glance at me and say, "Lauren, I have to ask. Does Nathan really still run that little construction company?" His tone was friendly on the surface, but the message underneath was obvious. Lauren looked at me for a moment. Not with anger. Not with embarrassment. Something worse. A quiet disappointment. "Nathan likes keeping things simple," she replied. "He has always been more comfortable with smaller projects." The people around her smiled. Nobody said anything cruel. Nobody needed to. Sometimes the most painful moments are the ones where people do not have to raise their voices. I stood there holding a glass of water, listening to strangers discuss my life like they already knew the ending. They saw the dusty pickup truck I drove. They saw the work shirts covered with signs of long days. They saw a man who built homes with his hands and assumed that was the limit of what I could build. What they did not know was that I never measured success by the size of my office or the number of people who knew my name. I measured it by what stayed standing after the work was done. My company, Carter Construction Group, started with a used toolbox, a borrowed truck, and a promise I made to myself when I was 22 years old. Build things that last. I had spent 2 decades following that promise. While others chased attention, I focused on foundations. While others wanted people to notice the finished building, I cared about every piece hidden underneath. The funny thing about foundations is that nobody thinks about them when everything is stable. They only become important when people realize how much they were holding up. Lauren used to understand that. She was there when I took my first real contract. She was there when we celebrated my first employee. She was there when we stood in the driveway of our first home and dreamed about everything we would create together. Back then, she never called my work small. She called it meaningful. But somewhere along the way, the world around her became louder than the promises we made. Status mattered more. Titles mattered more. The opinions of people at events like this started carrying more weight than the person standing beside her. Ethan lifted his glass and smiled. "Well, at least someone has the courage to follow their passion." The sentence sounded like a compliment, but everyone understood what he meant. I looked across the room at the massive glass windows behind them. Beyond those windows stood the city skyline, glowing under the night sky. And behind that skyline was a truth nobody in that room knew yet. I did not need to prove I belonged there. I already did. The only question was how long it would take before everyone else discovered it. I placed my glass on the table, adjusted my jacket, and looked back at Lauren. She was still smiling, still believing she understood exactly who I was. That was the part one found hardest to accept. After all these years, my own wife had no idea what I had built. After that night at Sterling Plaza, I drove home through streets I had traveled 1,000 times before, but everything felt different. The city lights reflected against my windshield, and I kept thinking about the look on Lauren's face when she described my company as something small. It was not the words themselves that stayed with me. I had heard people underestimate me before. In construction, you learn quickly that people judge what they can see. A clean office, a designer suit, and a polished presentation often impress people more than years of hard work. What stayed with me was the fact that the person who once believed in me now saw me through someone else's eyes. When I got home, I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and looked around the room we had built together. The wooden cabinets, the stone fireplace, the wide windows facing the backyard. Every corner of that house carried a memory, not because it was expensive, but because I remembered the days when we could barely afford to replace a broken appliance. I remembered Lauren sitting beside me at our old kitchen table, looking over my first business plans while I explained every detail of my dream. Back then, she never asked how impressive my company looked. She asked how many people I could help. She asked what kind of reputation I wanted to build. She believed in the man behind the work. Somewhere along the way, that changed. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise like I always did. Construction does not wait for anyone. There are crews arriving at job sites, materials being delivered, and schedules that need attention. My alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning, and by 6:15, I was already standing in my garage drinking coffee while checking project updates on my phone. That routine had been part of my life for years. Some people saw a construction owner and imagined dirt, noise, and unfinished buildings. They did not see the planning meetings, the contracts, the responsibility of making sure dozens of workers had steady jobs. They did not see the trust people placed in me every time they handed me a project worth millions of dollars. I drove my old pickup truck to the office, the same truck I had owned for nearly 10 years. It had scratches on the doors and a faded company logo on the side. I could have replaced it years ago. I simply never felt the need. My truck worked. My company worked. My life worked. At least, that was what I thought. When I arrived at Carter Construction Group, my team was already moving through the morning routine. Blueprints covered the conference table. Coffee cups sat beside project folders. Phones rang. People asked questions. It was not glamorous, but it was real. This was the world I understood. My office was not filled with expensive decorations or awards displayed on walls. It was filled with reminders of projects completed and people who counted on us. I walked past a framed photo near my desk. It showed our first major commercial project. At the time, it was the biggest opportunity one had ever received. I remembered standing there with Lauren on the opening day, both of us smiling like we had just won the lottery. She had held my hand and said, "You are going to build something incredible, Nathan." I wondered when she stopped believing that. That afternoon, Lauren called me while I was reviewing a set of architectural plans. Her voice sounded professional, almost like she was speaking to a coworker instead of her husband. "Are you still coming to the company event next week?" she asked. I paused for a moment. "I thought you said last night that you did not want me there." There was silence on the other end. "That is not what I meant," she said. But we both knew it was exactly what she meant. I looked out the window of my office toward the city skyline. "Lauren, I have never cared about impressing your coworkers." She sighed. "Nathan, you do not understand. People notice things." Those words stayed with me. People notice things. They noticed my truck. They noticed my work clothes. They noticed that I was not trying to look wealthy. But they did not notice the years behind everything I had built. They did not notice the late nights solving problems. They did not notice the employees who bought their first homes because they had steady work with my company. I ended the call quietly. I did not argue. I did not try to convince her. Some truths cannot be explained to someone who has already decided what they want to believe. Later that evening, I sat alone in my office after everyone had left. The building was quiet. The city outside was glowing. I opened an old folder containing documents from the earliest days of my company. Not because I needed to remember my success. I needed to remember my purpose. Before the money, before the contracts, before anyone cared about my name, there was simply a young man with a toolbox who wanted to create something meaningful. That was still who I was. And what Lauren did not know was that the biggest chapters of my story had never been the ones she could see. The first time I met Lauren, she did not see a small construction company owner. She saw a man with a vision. That was the part one kept remembering when everything started changing. We met 20 years earlier in a coffee shop near a community college where I was taking evening classes in construction management. I walked in wearing work boots, carrying a notebook filled with measurements and project ideas. She was sitting by the window with a book in front of her, wearing a simple blue sweater and a smile that made the entire room feel quieter. She asked what I was working on, and I told her about my dream of building a company that people could trust. I expected a polite answer. Instead, she leaned forward and asked questions for nearly an hour. She wanted to know why certain buildings lasted longer than others. She wanted to know why some contractors failed while others earned respect. She did not care about appearances. She cared about the person behind the dream. Those early years were not easy. We lived in a small apartment with old carpet and a kitchen that barely had enough space for two people to stand comfortably. We counted every dollar. We cooked simple meals. We planned our future on weekends with a notebook between us. Lauren would write down ideas for our home someday, and I would write down goals for my company. We were not wealthy, but we were building something together. I still remember the first major project Carter Construction Group received. It was a modest commercial renovation, but to me, it felt like an opportunity that could change everything. I spent weeks preparing the proposal. I stayed late studying every detail. When I finally received the approval call, I drove home faster than I should have, walked through the door, and told Lauren the news. She jumped from the couch and hugged me. She looked at me like I had already succeeded. She said, "Nathan, you are going to build something bigger than you realize." For a long time, that was enough. Her belief gave me confidence when I had doubts. Her support gave me energy when the work became difficult. But success has a strange way of changing the environment around people. It does not always change the person. Sometimes it changes the way others look at them. As Carter Construction Group grew, Lauren's career grew too. She moved into the corporate world and started working with people who measured everything by titles, offices, and appearances. At first, I was proud of her. I attended her events. I listened to her talk about campaigns, meetings, and professional goals. I wanted her to succeed. But slowly, I noticed something different. Conversations that used to be about dreams became conversations about status. She started comparing our life to the lives of people around her. She talked about expensive restaurants, luxury vacations, and executives who owned multiple properties. I never judged those things. Everyone has different goals. But I noticed that my work was becoming something she explained instead of something she celebrated. One evening, we attended a dinner with some of her colleagues. Someone asked what I did, and before I could answer, Lauren smiled and said, "Nathan runs a small construction company." It was a simple sentence. Most people would not have thought anything about it. But I knew the difference between describing something and reducing it. My company was not small because it lacked ambition. It was built carefully. It had employees who trusted me. It had clients who returned because they knew my word mattered. But in that moment, I realized Lauren no longer saw the years behind the name. She only saw what could be compared. After that, the distance between us grew quietly. There were no dramatic arguments. No single moment where everything fell apart. It was more subtle than that. A missed conversation here. A dismissive comment there. A growing feeling that I was standing beside someone who no longer understood why I was proud of the life we had created. The hardest part was that I still remembered the woman who believed in me before anyone knew my name. I remembered the woman who saw potential in a man with a toolbox and a dream. I wondered if she had forgotten that person completely, or if she had simply allowed the world around her to convince her that success only looked one certain way. What she did not know was that I had spent years building quietly. And sometimes the strongest structures are the ones nobody notices until they realize how much they depend on them. For years, I believed the most important part of building a company was creating something people could see. A finished building, a completed project, a structure that stood tall against the weather and time. But I eventually learned that the most important things are often the ones hidden beneath the surface. The same was true for my life. Most people looked at Carter Construction Group and saw a local business. They saw a company with a few dozen employees, a collection of trucks, and a reputation for quality work. They did not see the decisions made behind closed doors. They did not see the risks, the planning, or the years of patience that turned a simple idea into something much larger. And Lauren never saw that side either. She saw the version of my company that was easiest to explain. The version that fit into a conversation at a corporate dinner. A small construction company. A hardworking husband. A man who preferred work boots over designer shoes. What she did not know was that I had never been interested in looking successful. I was interested in becoming successful. There is a difference. Early in my career, I learned that growth does not always come from making the loudest move. Sometimes it comes from making the smartest one. When other contractors were chasing every opportunity they could find, I focused on building relationships. I focused on reliability. I focused on understanding every part of the industry, not just the part people noticed. After years of working on residential projects, I started taking on larger commercial contracts. Then I started investing in properties connected to those projects. Not because I wanted attention, because I understood something important about construction. The person who builds the walls is important, but the person who understands the entire structure has the greatest opportunity. I began creating a separate investment company called Carter Holdings. I kept it private. I never put my name on giant signs. I never walked into rooms expecting people to recognize me. I preferred letting results speak when the time was right. Lauren knew I had investments, but she never asked for details. At one point, she even joked that I was too careful with money. She said I treated every decision like I was building a bridge that needed to last 100 years. I smiled because she was right. That was exactly how I thought. Every decision was part of a foundation. A few years earlier, one of the biggest opportunities of my career appeared. A major office property in downtown Chicago called Sterling Plaza was going through a transition. The building had incredible potential, but the previous owners had focused too much on appearance and not enough on long-term value. I studied the numbers for months. I looked at the location, the structure, the future possibilities. I saw what others missed. It was not just a building. It was an opportunity to restore something valuable. Through Carter Holdings, I became the majority owner of Sterling Plaza. The process was complicated and required patience, but I knew it was the right decision. I never told Lauren because I wanted to avoid changing the way she looked at me. I wanted to know that if I succeeded, it would be because of who I was, not because of what I owned. Looking back, that decision revealed something I did not want to admit. I had been protecting our marriage from the truth because I was afraid the truth would change it. I was afraid that if Lauren knew exactly what I had built, she might suddenly treat me differently. And the painful part was that she already had, just not for the reason I feared. She had changed because she believed I had less. One afternoon, I was reviewing documents at my office when my assistant, Melissa, walked in with a folder. "Nathan, the Sterling Plaza management report is ready for your review," she said. I nodded and opened the folder. Everything looked normal. Occupancy rates, maintenance schedules, tenant information. But one detail caught my attention. Lauren's company had recently renewed their lease in the building. I sat there quietly for a moment. The woman who felt embarrassed by my small construction business worked every day inside a building that belonged to me. I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel the need to prove anything. I simply felt the strange weight of a truth that had been waiting patiently. The world had already shown Lauren what she wanted to see. A man in work boots. A small business owner. Someone easy to underestimate. But she had never taken the time to look beneath the surface. And beneath the surface was the story she never expected to find. The truth about people is that they rarely change because of what you say. They change when reality finally becomes impossible to ignore. For years, I kept my business life separate from my personal life because I believed success was something you built for yourself, not something you used to impress others. I never wanted Lauren to look at me differently because of a title, a bank account, or a building with my name attached to it. I wanted her to see Nathan, the same man she met years ago in that small coffee shop. The man with a notebook full of ideas and a dream that seemed bigger than his circumstances. But after everything that happened at Sterling Plaza, I started wondering if I had been protecting an image that no longer existed. The week after the company dinner, Lauren became more distant. She was not openly cold. In some ways, that would have been easier. Instead, she acted like everything was normal. She talked about her meetings, her deadlines, and her upcoming projects. She asked about my day, but the questions felt automatic, like she was checking a box instead of showing interest. I noticed small things. The way she changed the subject when I talked about a new construction project. The way she became more engaged when discussing her company events. The way she spoke proudly about the executives she worked with, but casually mentioned the people who worked for me. I never expected everyone to understand my choices. I knew construction was not a glamorous industry. It was early mornings, long drives, complicated schedules, and solving problems that most people never noticed. But I also knew something Lauren seemed to forget. Every office building, every luxury apartment, every impressive skyline people admired started with someone willing to do the work nobody celebrated. One Monday morning, I arrived at Sterling Plaza for a scheduled property review. I had visited the building many times before, but I usually entered through a private management entrance. That day, I decided to walk through the main lobby. The marble floors reflected the morning sunlight. Employees moved quickly through the entrance carrying coffee cups and briefcases. It was the kind of place where people felt important simply because they worked there. I stood near the front desk reviewing notes on my tablet when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Nathan, what are you doing here? I turned around. Lauren stood there with two co-workers from her department. Her expression changed slightly when she saw me. Not because she was surprised I was in the building, because she was surprised I looked like I belonged there. I have a property meeting, I said calmly. One of her co-workers smiled politely. Oh, are you working on a renovation project here? It was an innocent question, but I understood what he assumed. He thought I was there because my company had been hired to repair something. Lauren gave a small smile. Nathan is always working on something. I looked at her for a moment. Years ago, that sentence would have sounded supportive. Now it sounded like she was explaining me to people who did not know me. Before I could answer, the building manager approached. Mr. Carter, good morning. The conference room is ready whenever you are. The conversation stopped. I noticed the change immediately. The people around Lauren looked at me differently. Not dramatically, not with excitement, just with curiosity. They had heard my name spoken with respect. They had seen the way the building manager addressed me. But I simply nodded and continued walking. I did not need to explain anything. Later that afternoon, I reviewed the upcoming tenant meetings for Sterling Plaza. Everything was routine until I saw Lauren's company listed among the appointments. Their lease renewal was scheduled for the following month. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Not anger, not pride, something closer to disappointment. The building where Lauren spent every day represented something she had never understood about me. I was not chasing appearances. I was creating foundations. That evening, Lauren came home and mentioned that someone at work had asked about me. She laughed softly and said, "People were curious why the building manager knew you." I looked up from the documents on the table. "What did you tell them?" She paused. It was only for a second, but I noticed. "I just said you were involved in some construction projects." There it was again. The same pattern. She still described me by what she thought people would understand, not by the reality of what I had built. I closed the folder in front of me and looked at the woman I had shared half my life with. I realized something important. The biggest reveal was never going to be about a building. It was about whether Lauren could finally see the person standing in front of her. And soon, she would have no choice but to see everything. The strange thing about secrets is that they are rarely hidden because they are impossible to find. They are hidden because nobody thinks to look in the right place. For years, Lauren had been standing closer to the truth than anyone else, but she never noticed it because she had already decided who I was. In her mind, I was Nathan Carter, the man who owned a small construction company, the man who preferred job sites over boardrooms, the man who spent his mornings reviewing blueprints instead of attending executive meetings. She never imagined there was another side of my life because she never believed there needed to be one. But that was about to change. The following week, Sterling Plaza was preparing for its annual ownership and management meeting. It was not a public event. It was a private gathering where investors, executives, and major tenants discussed the future of the property. I attended these meetings every year, but I usually stayed in the background. I listened more than I spoke. I believed good leadership was not about making sure everyone knew your name. It was about making sure everything worked when nobody was watching. That morning, I arrived early. The conference room overlooked downtown Chicago, with glass windows stretching from the floor to the ceiling. Below us, the city was already moving. Cars filled the streets. People rushed toward their offices. Everyone was focused on their own responsibilities, unaware of the conversations happening above them. I reviewed the reports before the meeting started. Revenue numbers, maintenance updates, tenant satisfaction surveys, future development plans. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. Then the door opened. Lauren walked in. For a moment, neither of us said anything. She was holding a folder and wearing the same confident expression she wore at her corporate events. But this time, there was uncertainty behind it. "Nathan," she said, "what are you doing here?" I looked at her calmly. "I could ask you the same question." She glanced around the room. Her eyes moved from the executives to the documents on the table. Something felt different. She was starting to realize she was not walking into another ordinary meeting. "I have a presentation for the tenant relations team," she said. I nodded. "That makes sense." She looked at me carefully. "Why are you in this room?" Before I could answer, the property director entered. His expression immediately changed when he saw Lauren standing there. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. We are ready whenever you are." Lauren heard the way he addressed me. She noticed the respect in his voice. She noticed that everyone in the room looked to me before taking their seats. But I still said nothing. I let the moment exist without explanation. The meeting began, and Lauren sat across from me. For the first time in years, she was seeing a side of my life she had never experienced. She watched executives discuss decisions with me. She watched people ask for my opinion. She watched the same man she had described as someone with a small business make decisions that affected an entire building. Still, I did not enjoy watching her reaction. I did not feel like I had won something. A marriage should never feel like a competition. I only felt the sadness of realizing that the person closest to me had known the least about me. During a discussion about future renovations, one executive mentioned how important Carter Holdings had been in preserving the property. Lauren looked up immediately. Carter Holdings, she repeated quietly. Nobody answered because everyone assumed she already knew. That was when I saw the questions forming in her eyes. After the meeting ended, she waited outside the conference room. Nathan, we need to talk. I closed my folder and looked at her. About what? She lowered her voice. About why everyone here treats you like you are someone important. I almost smiled at the irony of that sentence. Someone important. After all the years we had spent together, she was only now asking that question. Lauren, I have always been the same person. She looked away. No, you are not. I took a moment before responding. Actually, I am. The difference is that you are seeing something you never bothered to notice. She did not have an answer. For once, the silence between us was not because we had nothing to say. It was because the truth was finally standing in the room with us. That evening, Lauren started searching for answers. She looked through public records, company information, and property details. She was not searching for money. She was searching for the version of me she had somehow missed. And what she found was not just a business achievement. It was years of decisions, patience, and quiet work. It was proof that the man she thought she understood had been building something much larger. All along. The next morning, she would discover the full story. And after that, nothing about the way she saw me would ever be the same. The morning after Lauren discovered the truth about Sterling Plaza, I noticed something I had not seen in a long time. She was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that came from being busy or distracted. It was the quiet of someone trying to understand something that no longer fit the story they had created. For years, Lauren had believed she knew exactly who I was. She knew my habits, my routines, the way I spent my mornings, and the way I approached my work. But she had mistaken familiarity for understanding. She knew the details of my life, but she had stopped seeing the meaning behind them. That morning, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, holding a cup of coffee that had gone untouched. The sunlight came through the windows, the same windows we had picked out together years earlier when we renovated the house. It was strange how a familiar place could suddenly feel different. Why did you never tell me? She finally asked. I looked at her for a moment. There were many answers I could have given. I could have explained the years of planning. I could have described every decision that led me to Sterling Plaza. I could have listed every accomplishment she never knew about. But none of those things were the real answer. Because I never wanted you to care about what I owned, I said. I wanted you to care about who I was. She looked down at the table. For the first time in a long time, I saw something other than confidence in her expression. I saw reflection. She remembered the things she had said. The comments at dinners. The moments when she introduced my work as something small. The times when she acted like my career was something she had to explain instead of something she could celebrate. Nathan, I did not know, she said quietly. I nodded. That is the problem. You never tried to know. The truth was not that Lauren failed to understand my success. The truth was that she stopped being curious about me long before she learned about Sterling Plaza. A few days later, Lauren returned to work, but the atmosphere around her had changed. People at the office had started asking questions. They had heard about the ownership meeting. They had seen how executives interacted with me. They had realized that the man they casually dismissed at the company dinner was connected to the building they walked into every morning. But I did not want attention. I did not need people suddenly treating me differently. That was never the reason I worked so hard. A person's value should not increase because others discover their achievements. It should exist before anyone notices. During the following week, I attended another management meeting at Sterling Plaza. This time, Lauren was there as well. She sat quietly while the discussion moved through future improvements and long-term plans. At one point, the property director mentioned how Carter Holdings had focused on preserving the building's history instead of simply increasing profits. I watched Lauren listen carefully. She was hearing my values described by people who worked with me every day. Patience, responsibility, long-term thinking. The same qualities she once admired before the world around her convinced her they were not enough. After the meeting, she approached me in the hallway. The same hallway where hundreds of employees walked every day without knowing the story behind the person standing there. "I owe you an apology," she said. I stayed quiet. Not because I wanted her to feel bad, but because I wanted her to understand. "I thought success looked different," she continued. "I thought I knew what mattered." I looked out through the glass windows toward the city. "Everyone gets to decide what success means to them," I said. "But the mistake is believing your definition is the only one." She nodded slowly. "I forgot who you were." Those words were heavier than any apology, because that was exactly what had happened. She had not forgotten my name. She had forgotten the person behind it. The person who worked before sunrise. The person who built a company one project at a time. The person who never needed a room full of executives to feel important. I walked away from that conversation without anger. I did not feel the need to make Lauren regret anything. Life had already taught its lesson. The truth had already arrived. For years, people looked at my boots, my truck, and my small office and assumed they knew my story. They saw what was visible and ignored what was underneath. But every strong foundation has something hidden below the surface. And sometimes, the things people overlook are the very things holding everything together. After everything that happened, I expected life to become easier. I thought that once the truth was finally known, the tension would disappear and things would naturally fall back into place. But I learned something important. A revelation can change what people see, but it cannot instantly repair what has been ignored for years. The real challenge was not showing Lauren what I had built. The real challenge was understanding whether she could finally see the person who had been beside her all along. The weeks that followed were quieter than usual. Not uncomfortable, just different. Lauren started asking questions. Real questions. Not about numbers or properties or business decisions. Questions about my choices, my goals, and the reasons behind the way I lived my life. One evening, we sat outside on the back porch with 2 cups of coffee between us. It was the same porch where we had spent countless nights years earlier, when our biggest concern was whether we could afford our next home improvement project. "I keep thinking about the past," Lauren said. "About when we first met." I looked out at the backyard. "So do I." She smiled slightly. "You were so certain about everything. Even when you had almost nothing, you acted like you had everything you needed." I nodded. Because I did. I had a purpose. I had someone who believed in me. The silence that followed felt different from the silence we had grown used to. This one was not filled with distance. It was filled with honesty. Lauren looked down at her hands. I think I started measuring everything the wrong way. I did not interrupt. Some conversations need space. I started thinking success meant having the right title, being invited to the right events, knowing the right people. Somewhere along the way, I stopped appreciating the things that were already in front of me. Her words were not a solution. They did not erase years of feeling overlooked, but they were a beginning. I had spent my life building things from the ground up. I understood that strong structures were not created overnight. They required time, patience, and attention. Relationships were no different. Around that same time, I returned my focus to Carter Construction Group. Business was growing, and we had several new projects beginning across the city. One of those projects involved renovating older commercial spaces and turning them into places where small businesses could grow. It reminded me why I entered construction in the first place. Buildings were never just about concrete and steel. They were about people. A restaurant owner opening their first location. A company hiring new employees. A family walking into a place they could call home. Those were the moments that mattered. A few months earlier, I would have assumed Lauren would never understand that. But something had changed. She began visiting project sites with me. Not as someone trying to impress others. Not as someone looking for a story to tell at a corporate event. She came because she wanted to understand. One afternoon, we stood outside a renovation project where my team was preparing an old building for new businesses. Lauren watched the workers reviewing plans and solving problems together. "I never realized how much goes into this," she said. I smiled. Most people do not. They see the finished building. They do not see the people who made it possible. She looked at the structure in front of us for a long moment. "I think I did that with you." I knew what she meant. She had seen the finished results of my life without understanding the work behind them. She had looked at what was visible and missed everything underneath. That evening, I drove home feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Not victory. Not satisfaction from proving someone wrong. Something better. Peace. Because the truth was, I never wanted Lauren to feel embarrassed for underestimating me. I wanted her to understand that my value had never depended on whether she recognized it. I had built my company before people respected it. I had built my reputation before people noticed it. And I had built my life based on principles that existed long before anyone cared about the results. The world often celebrates what it can see. The awards, the titles, the buildings reaching toward the sky. But the most important parts of any life are usually hidden. The patience, the sacrifices, the decisions made when nobody is watching. That was the lesson I had learned. And maybe, finally, it was the lesson Lauren was beginning to learn too. Years after that night at Sterling Plaza, I found myself standing in the lobby of the same building where everything changed. The marble floors still reflected the morning light. The same elevators opened and closed. The same employees walked through the entrance carrying coffee cups and briefcases, focused on the beginning of another workday. But I was not the same man who stood there years earlier, wondering if the person beside me still understood me. I had learned that sometimes the greatest changes happen quietly. Not every victory needs applause. Not every transformation needs an audience. Some of the most meaningful moments happen when you finally understand your own worth without needing someone else to confirm it. Carter Construction Group continued to grow, but I kept the same principles that built it. We remained focused on quality, trust, and long-term relationships. I still visited job sites. I still walked through unfinished spaces and listened to the people doing the work. I still believed that leadership was not about standing above others. It was about standing with them. The company had expanded, and more people knew my name, but I never wanted recognition to become the reason I worked. I had spent too many years building quietly to suddenly become someone who needed constant attention. Lauren changed too. Not overnight. Not because of one conversation. Real change rarely happens that way. It happened through small moments. She started asking about my projects because she was genuinely interested. She started understanding that the people who worked for me were not just employees. They were individuals with families, goals, and dreams of their own. She started seeing the value in things she once overlooked. One afternoon, we visited a new development project together. The building was still under construction, with workers reviewing plans and preparing different sections of the property. Lauren looked around and smiled. "I understand now," she said. I looked at her. Understand what? She looked at the structure around us. Why you never cared about looking successful. You cared about creating something meaningful. Her words stayed with me because they showed me she finally understood the difference. For a long time, people had confused appearance with achievement. They believed success was something you could recognize immediately. A luxury car, a large office, a powerful title. But the truth is that many of the most successful people are not the ones making the most noise. They are the ones quietly building something that lasts. I thought about the younger version of myself. The man sitting in that small coffee shop with a notebook full of ideas. The man who drove an old truck and carried tools everywhere he went. The man who had no guarantee that his dream would work out, but decided to try anyway. That man was still part of me. The buildings, the investments, and the success were just results. They were not the reason. The reason was always the same. I wanted to create something that mattered. I wanted my work to have purpose. I wanted people to know that dedication was valuable even when nobody noticed it. Looking back, the hardest part of the journey was not building a company. It was accepting that some people will only recognize your value after they see your achievements. But by then, your value was already there. It never depended on their approval. It never depended on their opinion. It existed from the beginning. Lauren once looked at my work boots and saw something ordinary. She once looked at my small office and assumed it represented my limits. But she eventually learned what I had always known. A person cannot be measured by what others see on the surface. The strongest foundations are hidden. The most important work often happens when nobody is watching. And the people who truly understand success are not the ones who only admire the finished building. They are the ones who respect everything it took to build it. As I walked through Sterling Plaza that morning, I looked around at the walls, the offices, and the people moving through the building. Every piece of it represented years of patience, decisions, and belief. It was never just about owning a building. It was about proving something to myself. That quiet determination could become something powerful. That staying true to who you are mattered more than changing yourself to impress others. And that sometimes, The people who underestimate you are simply looking at the unfinished version of a story that has not revealed its final chapter yet.